Good morning. I have an announcement to make. If you look at your program for this panel, Racism in Politics, don't believe almost anything that you see there. It says that Arnon Soki is moderating. He didn't show up today, so I'm the backup moderator. In addition, two of our panelists didn't show up, so we've had some rearranging to do, and I think it really says a lot about the efficiency of the Conference on World Affairs that here we are. But be gentle, because we really haven't had all that much time to prepare. Today is Wednesday, April 11. It is 9 a.m., and this is panel number 3008, Racism in Politics. The dog whistle is deafening. I'm Albert Hand. I'm a retired Wall Street lawyer who moved to Boulder 14 years ago. Little housekeeping note, please silence your devices. Before I introduce the panelists, I have a question. A gentleman came up and said this panel is scheduled at 9 o'clock in the morning, whereas a bunch of other starting panels are scheduled at 9:30, and he was confused. If you had a problem or sense that this is a problem, that maybe panels ought to start every day at a set time, would you raise your hands? Okay, a goodly number of you have that issue. I will raise that with the powers that be. I don't know why they schedule 9 and 9:30, but it's certainly something to think about. I'm going to name the panelists. Usually at this point, I give a little thumbnail about what the panelists are all about, but I really haven't had time to prepare. Our three panelists today are Elizabeth McNamara, Ian Millhiser, and Malou Innocent. When they make their opening statements, if each of them would give just a thumbnail of who they are, then that would take care of that issue. What we will do is the format is start with each panelist will make an opening statement of 10 or so minutes, and when they are done, those opening statements will have for sure coughed up some issues, so we'll after that have a period where the other panelists may respond to points that one of their fellow panelists have made. And then finally, after that, the first opening statement, second panelist talking with each other, then we'll open up for questions and answers. As you probably know by now, we don't use microphones anymore because that didn't work so well. People tended to make speeches rather than ask questions. So what we've done is reverted to a CWA app where you can use your iPhone to ask questions. We're not going to, because of the sort of makeshift, the way this particular panel happened to be put together this morning, what we're going to do is use note cards. So if you, at any time during the presentation, if a question occurs to you, raise your hand, and one of our two producers, Michael Ryan and Jean Barrett, are available to give you, when your hand is raised, a note card with a pencil. You can write your question. Please write it legibly. And if you're a student, we give priority to student questions. Please note that, and the note on your note card, and the note cards will be delivered to me, and I will ask your question, and the panelists will respond. Let's see. Is there anything else? I think not, and we had a brief discussion off stage as to the order. I think Ian, everybody thought Ian should go first, and then Elizabeth and Malou, who wants to go next? Malou would go second, and then Elizabeth, and let's get started.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ian Millhiser. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, which is one of the major think tanks in D.C. I edit the justice content at Think Progress. I'm a constitutional lawyer by training. And I spent my morning actually reworking what I was going to say at this panel, because I spent my morning reworking what we're going to say at this panel because we have a bit of breaking news. Happy Paul Ryan's retirement day. And that actually is quite relevant to this topic, because I think that Ryanism, it plays a major role in explaining why there was an opening for someone like Donald Trump to rise to power. So before I start, I just want to dispel with this fiction that racism may not have played a role in Trump's election. I've got a lot of stats here. I won't quote all of them, but just to throw a few at you. In the GOP primary, slightly more than 20% of Republican voters with low levels of white racial identity supported Donald Trump as the Republican candidate. About 55% of Republican voters with high levels of white racial identity supported Trump in the primary. There's one academic study that found in the general election that white voters with high levels of racial resentment were 40 percentage points more likely to vote for Trump than white voters with low levels of racial resentment. So what you see when you look at the Trump electorate is you see three things. One is not everyone was motivated by racism. There were definitely people who were just Republicans and they pull the lever for whoever their party's nominee is, and this year it was Donald Trump. But many of them were motivated by racism, or at least were more excited about this candidate because of some of the things he said on the trail. And then the third thing that I think we have to deal with as a country is every one of the 60 million people who voted for Donald Trump were willing to accept an open racist as their president, regardless of whether they viewed it as a good thing or a bad thing. They didn't view it as bad enough to disqualify him. And so that's a phenomenon that we have to deal with. Trump is not a new phenomenon. Trump is actually a very old phenomenon. And it's hard to talk about. I want to distinguish between Trump the candidate and Trump the president, because as president, he has melded Paul Ryan-style austerity with the sort of racist populism that he offered on the campaign trail in a way that I think wasn't foreshadowed as much by the way he ran his campaign. In the United States, there's a long tradition of a kind of racist populism which says that we're going to be very generous to in-groups while being very cruel to out-groups. And that was how Donald Trump campaigned as president. He promised to preserve Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Hasn't done the best job of that since he got into office, or at least his backed bills that did not pass that would have gutted many of those programs. But as a candidate, he follows in a long tradition of people like George Wallace, who started off as a New Dealer. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Selma, but there's an important scene where LBJ says to him, "George, what are you doing? You used to really care about poverty." So there's a long tradition of this kind of white populism. Probably one of the pioneering figures of this style of politics was a man named Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who came to power as the leader of an organized lynch mob. This guy began his career in racist terrorism, and he wound up becoming the governor of South Carolina and then a very powerful senator who controlled the patronage in that state. But Ben Tillman also created much of South Carolina's university system. The Tillman Act was the first law banning corporate donations in politics. So my point is, and I can rattle off other people. Roosevelt's right-hand man was a guy named Jimmy Burns, who was very much in that mold. So there's a long line of these kinds of politicians who are, generous to what they perceive as the in-group, which is normally white voters, and very cruel to racial minorities. What is interesting about the politics we have seen, probably from the 70s until 2016, is that kind of politics didn't really have a partisan home. For many years, that kind of politics sort of parked itself in the Southern Democrats. And then when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, those voters largely decided they were through with the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party had rallied behind Paul Ryan's style of politics, which was not so friendly to the we're going to preserve Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid side of what Donald Trump campaigned on. Which brings me back to my beginning, which is that the agenda that Paul Ryan pushed, my organization, the Center for American Progress Action Fund, did some polling on this, and we found that only 19% of voters in the lead up to the 2016 election supported the Ryan budget with its mix of deep Medicaid cuts and privatizing Medicare and cutting food stamps and tax cuts for the rich. It was not popular. And in fact, it was not only was it not popular with the public at large, but it was unpopular with Republicans. It was unpopular with Republican donors. Just about the only group of people who supported the Ryan budget were Republican donors who earn more than $250,000 a year. And so when you have a party that is speaking exclusively to a very small segment of the population, that party became vulnerable. All of a sudden, if their primary messengers weren't appealing to people, then it created an opening for something else to move in. And that something else was Donald Trump, who, whether through insight or more likely through instinct, since we're talking about Trump, seemed to realize that there was still a hunger for this pitchfork Ben Tillman, George Wallace style politics that promises generosity to the in-group and cruelty to the out-group. I guess I will, say, because I have a little more time, I will say one more thing that I had planned to discard from my remarks to make time for Paul Ryan. But one thing that I thought was interesting in the lead-up to the 2016 election is that I think the dominant view being advanced, at least by elite conservatives in the racial space, is what is also often referred to as, depending on what side of the issue you fall on, colorblind politics, or a lot of the sociological literature refers to it as colorblind racism. The most prominent practitioner of this kind of politics is John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States. This is what led him to say, like, oh, we're just so much less racist than we used to be, so we don't need a Voting Rights Act anymore. Or at least we don't need a fully operational Voting Rights Act. And I thought at the time that John Roberts was rather naive and quite misguided, but that he was acting in good faith. That they actually believed that this style of politics would work to cure the racial divides in our country. I think it's hard to maintain that position in the wake of the election that we just had. To believe that if we just, in the words of Stephen Colbert, claim that I don't see race. People tell me I'm white and I believe them because I can't dance. If we if people continue to cling to that belief that we can just ignore race and racism will go away, I think we are going to continue to find ourselves disappointed. And I think, if anything, this election shows that John Roberts' assumption that we could start to dismantle the protections that we put in place in order to ward off racism in politics is a hugely misguided project, and that I hope that he has the self-awareness to think about reversing it.
Thank you all for coming this morning. Can you all hear me? Great. I'm an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, I focus mainly on Middle East and Persian Gulf security issues and U.S. foreign policy toward Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China. I'm here today because I want to take you through a little bit of the dog whistle politics. And as Ian just mentioned, this is part of our country's rich tradition. This is nothing new. Just the latest iteration being the current occupant of the White House. What I want to do is sort of, take you through several examples, very explicit examples. So, trigger warning. I'm going to be using a lot of very loaded terminology and some very racist quotes, just to really show you that this isn't just theoretical or abstract. This is actual real-life politics. And I'm going to take you through some of the examples, but also what happens when problems arise when we don't hear the whistle when it comes from our own side. It's almost as if, like identity politics, both on the left and the right, it almost becomes inaudible. The whistle itself becomes inaudible to our own overt biases. And also when problems arise when we hear the whistle so often that we're so trained to hear the whistle, we hear it in everyday life, even when there is nothing racist going on. We almost hear it all the time, and we become ultra sensitive to that. So I want to review some of that. So why is it that we have, dog whistle politics? What is dog whistle politics? Let's start with some definitions. It's when politicians, and this is just a crude definition, I just threw it together, when politicians use racially coded language they defend as benign or innocuous, but is intended to provoke very strong emotional reactions and responses in target audiences. In fact, Ian Haney Lopez, he's a law professor at my alma mater, UC Berkeley. He says either side, left or right, can use it, can be on either side of the political spectrum, and it doesn't always have to be malevolent. What's interesting is that, again, the current occupant of the White House, it's not even a coded language. It's almost, there's no plausible deniability because it's so overt. It's not a whistle as much of it as it's a megaphone. And I'm going to take you through just some recent examples. The latest being the birther movement, the birtherism. I think that was definitely a dog whistle. Also, a very seemingly innocuous one, the fact that, what is Barack Obama's middle name? Hussein.
Hussein.
What is John McCain's middle name? So that's something that, again, it seems innocuous. Okay, Barack Hussein Obama. Well, John McCain's middle name is Sydney. So this is the latest example of that, the birtherism. Another is just recently, I'm sure we're going to get to it in the Q&A, is the meeting in January with Donald Trump and senators and House members on immigration, when President Trump allegedly, I think he probably did, he may have, he allegedly asked, quote, "Why do we want all these people from shithole countries coming here?" Unquote. Apparently he was referencing immigrants from places like El Salvador, Haiti, and Africa that were being protected as a result of a bipartisan deal to preserve the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. There's also, his 2015 announcement speech where he said, quote, "They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people," unquote. And so that was, whether it's shithole or rapists, it's now overt. There is no plausible deniability in terms of the dog whistle. But where did this all come from? There's this idea that it came from Nixon's Southern strategy, and I think a historian sort of debate about whether it was top down or bottom up, whether it was top down from Republicans in Washington or whether it was bottom up appeals from suburbanites, white class voters. But either way, it's definitely clear that Nixon appealed to the notion of law and order using, again, coded language to appeal to white voters who, there was this backlash against the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, and there's this idea of appealing to that white Southern vote. And in fact, it was quoted that Nixon said after watching a TV ad featuring footage of riots, he said, quote, "Yep, this hits it right on the nose. It's all about law and order and the damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there," unquote. And Nixon aide John Ehrlichman, one of the plumbers, because they took care of the leaks from the Nixon White House. He said, quote, "The subliminal appeal to the anti-black vote was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches," unquote. Now, perhaps the biggest perpetrator of the dog whistle politics, at least on the right, was Lee Atwater. In fact, there's this great documentary called Boogeyman on Frontline. It's a great documentary. I'd encourage you to watch it. Lee Atwater was a strategist for the Republican Party. He was an advisor to both Presidents Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, and to the elder Bush. And he did a 1981 interview where he sort of explained the shift from the law and order appeal to the more welfare and tax appeal of the Republicans. And so I'm just going to read this to you, and I apologize for offending anyone here. Quote, "You started out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. It's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than saying nigger, nigger," unquote. Atwater really pioneered this idea of, the scary black man meme, which is just incredibly egregious. He did this during Bush's campaign in the late 80s, accusing his opponent, Michael Dukakis, of being soft on crime. It was the Willie Horton ad. We can go into it in the Q&A, but I'm sure a lot of you remember that. And then Ronald Reagan also had many examples of this. He did the much ballyhooed dog whistle of the welfare queen, or the strapping young buck who buys T-bone steaks using food stamps. It was a two-pronged dog whistle. It made it seem as if minorities were gaming the system, and it also was an appeal to white voters. Like, you work hard, you play by the rules, you pay your taxes, and these guys over here are gaming the system. And that was a way to rally support as well. The latest iteration of the sort of welfare or food stamp dog whistle being Newt Gingrich, who referred to President Obama as the food stamp president. Now, the latest iteration of this as well, we saw this during Trump's campaign, was white nationalist Richard Spencer. He cited demographics in both the United States and Europe to say that whites around the world were a threatened class. And he appealed to this identity politics to claim that multiculturalism was eroding and endangering indigenous white Europeans, both in the United States and in the continent. And this was identity politics based on white solidarity to appeal to white votes. Now let's shift to the identity politics of the left. And I don't want to be like Trump. I don't want to make a false equivalence here, like the Charlottesville rioters. But there is certainly an identity politics on the left, and I think it certainly is more benign, certainly. But it also appeals to immutable characteristics of group identity, which, although it's progressive and cosmopolitan and forward-looking, it could be arguably as harmful because you're still basing people on group identity rather than their individuals' beliefs. I think this idea of the left resorting to identity politics is understandable. It's sort of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If the right appeals to identity politics, then why don't we reach out with ethnic and religious and voter groups, whether that be blacks for Obama or Jews for Obama or gays for Obama. And that makes sense. You want to appeal to minority votes. You want to appeal to minority groups with racial and ethnic targeting in a way that sort of lifts all boats in some ways. Again, the latest iteration of this being Hillary Clinton referring to Trump supporters as deplorables. She later, backtracked on her statement and said it was only folks who went to his campaign rallies. It wasn't necessarily all Trump supporters. But I think this is where we sort of get into the issue of where left identity politics can backfire in some way. When you associate Trump's rhetoric with Trump's policies, that's where it gets a little dicey, because one can be for tax reform or for building a border wall or for healthcare overhaul and not necessarily be racist. And I think that's the trick, is because when folks on the right who have voted for Trump and they say, well, the left is calling me racist. I'm not racist. What else is the left wrong about? And that pushes support for Trump even more. That's why, if you wonder why politics has gotten really screamy and yelly as of the last few years, it's a lot of this identity politics, where we've been focused so much on politics, and this tribalism is really ripping the society apart. And I actually mentioned this in the panel the other day with Ian, that I think part of the issue is that we've come to look at political differences as a referendum on someone's moral character. And that is incredibly dangerous. One last point I want to make before because I'm going a little long with my comments, but there's so much to say about this topic, is what happens when we always hear the dog whistle. When we're so trained and so attuned to hearing it, we hear it all the time, even when it may not be there. There was this recent study by researchers at Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau on data covering over 20 million children and their parents on judging the rates of downward and upward intergenerational poverty. And the New York Times came out with a screaming headline saying, quote, "Extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys," unquote. Now, certainly there was a lot of the study focused on the generic American racism that could be playing into this. But one thing that the New York Times headline didn't get into, and I did my due diligence, I read over 100 pages of this report. A lot of it's very dry, but a lot of it's very fascinating. The variance of income inequality between blacks and whites was not just solely focused on differentiations of race. It was also things that were not just generalized on racial factors. In fact, they mention environmental conditions during childhood that have causal effects on racial disparities. They say, quote, black father presence at the neighborhood level strongly predicts black boys' outcomes irrespective of whether their own father is present or not, suggesting that matters is not parental marital status itself, but rather community level factors. And so they quote this throughout the study. And he gets to the point that high levels of men in a community, whether they're part of that family or not, is important because those men in the community can play a father figure role, almost like the social fabric of a neighborhood or a community. That's just but one example of where we sort of see race in almost everything, when there could be other causal explanations. And I think sometimes when it comes to social science, we forget the fact that we deal in the realm of theory and hypothesis, and we need to understand that because it is social science data, and there are many causes. If anyone says that there's a monocausal reason for any given phenomenon, you should just look at them very skeptically. My final, sort of concluding remarks is to understand why the dog whistle doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are reasons why these political dog whistles appeal to us, and it's not just political, but it's also cultural. Ian mentioned the whole thing about Colbert and white guys dancing, and it's sort of like a self-deprecating stereotype. And there's a history professor at American University, Ibram Kendi. He's an award-winning historian, and he's talked about what are the impacts of both negative and positive stereotypes. And he gives the idea of the black athlete. He himself is black, and he talks about black people are not inherently better athletes than white people. We only think so because black people have not only been rendered inferior by white people, they've been rendered like animals, and thus physically superior creatures. It's an old racist idea that helped justify African Americans' suitability for backbreaking labor. What are other sort of positive stereotypes? He points to the idea of the Asians are good at math. The nefarious part of this is that it connects race and ability. And that's a slippery slope to claiming that you know an individual based on a group. And so when we look at these racist dog whistles, let's also think about it in a more collective way. Let's think about it in terms of our culture and how a lot of the memes and tropes that we deal with on a daily basis, begin interrogating those, begin thinking and questioning why are those beliefs still so persistent, even if they're positive or self-deprecating, and they could have no malice behind them. Just think about, why that might be perpetrated in the discourse and why it could be negative as well. Thank you.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. All right. Let's get this right. Gotcha. All right. All right. So I'm the hope and change person. And also, just let me, as from a little bit on my background, I have volunteered now since 1983 with the League of Women Voters on all levels of government. I'm not a native of Georgia, but I've lived in Georgia since 1974 and volunteered with the League there. I've also been the national president of the League of Women Voters of the United States. For any of y'all who don't know about the League, I'm just going to mention here because it's relevant to this conversation, the fact that the League was founded in 1920 directly out of the women's suffrage movement, which if you know your history, and most of us don't know our women's history, I did not know my organizational history, and I'm going to circle around back to how important it is to know our history. Was a civil rights movement, was one of the very first civil rights movements in this country. But it was, because it was in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was largely a civil rights movement for white women. And the civil rights movement for black women, despite the fact that the 19th Amendment is gender neutral or is race neutral, actually didn't happen until much, much later in the 1960s, as we know. Professionally, I'm a lawyer, and I'm a prosecutor. And that, I will circle back around to that, to why that can influence the way we think about things. I was a prosecutor starting in the mid-1980s, which meant that I was prosecuting folks in DeKalb County, Georgia, which is at that time was a majority minority county, during the 1990s when we were all flush with cash. And it was the era of the super predator, 2 strikes, you're out, treating children as adults. That's me. And obviously, I'm a citizen and a voter in a majority-minority county that during my lifetime has shifted from a rich white-bedroom suburb of the city of Atlanta. If any of you all are familiar with Emory University and the Centers for Disease Control, that's my neighborhood. To a majority-minority county with large pockets of poverty, and all that brings with it. So, in preparing for this, I realized that this is not an academic exercise for me. This is my life. In 1954, when both Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and I was born. So my entire life has been, my entire educational pathway has been overshadowed by issues like integration and busing. Even though I didn't live in Georgia, I didn't live in places where really horrible things were happening in order to prevent those integration from happening. Nevertheless, it overshadowed my entire educational career. I am in the first class of 18-year-olds that got to vote for president in 1972. I am in the leading edge of young women who benefited from the second wave of the women's rights movement and was able to go to work in a professional capacity in ways that my mother was unable to do. As I said, in the 1990s, I was a prosecutor when we were getting really, really tough on crime. I was the president of the Georgia League in 2003 when one of the very, very first voter suppression bills dropped in the Georgia legislature and raced through really quickly. That was going to make it more difficult for everyone to vote, but was going to particularly impact underserved communities. And in 2016, in 2017, after the 2016 election, I live in the benighted 6th District of Georgia that made national news, as that was the very, very first effort on the part of the Democratic Party to take back a red district, a really deep red district in the Deep South. So this, as I said, this is not history. This is my life. And so figuring out how I feel about this and putting some perspective around this and recognizing dog whistles has been the work of my lifetime, and I think it's the work of a lot of our lifetimes. Sitting here, looking at the audience in the room, and so I want to, starting on the fact that I think there is hope out there in this whole situation, is that I want to remind everybody that all politics is local, and that we can focus an awful lot on things that have happened at the national level, and we can be concerned about the tenor of national politics. But looking around, for example, my local community and the changes that have happened in my local community, I see a lot of reason for hope. I went from having all white elected officials to having almost all African American elected officials just in the course of my adult lifetime. And I see reason for hope in that. Now, do we have a long way to go? Of course we have a long way to go. We have a huge Latino population in Georgia, and they are not represented at this point in government to the extent that they ought to be. There are still not enough women in politics, on whether of any race or ethnicity, and that's going to be a challenge for us moving forward. Obviously, all of these experiences that I've had have been in the metro Atlanta area. Atlanta, of course, if anybody know, I certainly didn't know when I moved to Atlanta to finish going to school, that Atlanta, of course, is the birthplace of the civil rights movement. I'm not sure that this was the news to me. This was the news I'm sure it was for an awful lot of us. And so what we're seeing, when you're seeing Birmingham, Montgomery, Albany, Georgia, you're not seeing Atlanta, where an awful lot of this was being organized out of. And so, of course, Atlanta was one of the communities, elected one of the first African-American mayors. Politics have changed tremendously. Again, reasons for hope. I did not know the history of my own organization. And I think a lot of us who volunteer particularly if you volunteer with organizations or you are organizing yourselves through groups that have been around for a little while, don't know the history of your own organization. I didn't know the suffrage movement was segregated until very recently. I did not realize until just a little while, well, I did know this, but I actually saw in Living Black and White at my local television station recently in honor of Women's History Month. They pulled some old footage, some archival footage, that included an interview with the national president of the League of Women Voters in the mid-1960s. In the mid-1960s, when the war on poverty is being considered in Congress, when the Voting Rights Act is moving through Congress, when the Civil Rights Act, the first meaningful Civil Rights Act in our history, was moving through Congress. And we are a political organization. We take positions on issues. We came out of a movement that fought for 70 years for voting rights for women in this country, that our national president, in an interview when asked about those, what is the League's position on those, said, well, we don't have one yet. We are studying it. Look for dodges on these things as well. And from the perspective of 2018, I was absolutely appalled. I knew it was true, but I hadn't actually heard it said and spoken. So knowing our history is really important. Putting our history in perspective is really important. I started voting in Georgia after the Voting Rights Act. I lived in a state that was totally covered by the Voting Rights Act. Everything had to be changed. I listened to all of the arguments that were being made before Shelby about how onerous this was and what an administrative burden this was, and I'm thinking, but in my lifetime, in my experience, in my community, no one broke a sweat complying with the Voting Rights Act, and it really made for a far more professional for much more professionalism in our election systems, not just in states like Georgia, but all across the country. Knowing our history, putting our own life experiences in perspective, particularly right now when these issues, thanks to Donald Trump and overt comments, as Malou has just outlined, is back on the table, and it's out there, we can see it, is really, really important. Having the facts and knowing where we came from can put a lot of things into perspective, can also diffuse a lot of things for us, I think. So probably we've been talking about dog whistles here. I'm going to tell you from my own experience in my own community, and I think this is reflected probably in other places, certainly across the Deep South, that the scariest dog whistle that I see out there is a dog whistle that resonates, I think, most particularly with those of us particularly in the liberal white community, and that is the dog whistle that says persons of color are all Democrats and white people are Republicans. Now, no one's saying that out loud, but I have watched in my own state people being sorted that way through partisan gerrymandering, through just messaging from elected officials, and that is on both sides of the aisle because it works for both parties. Dog whistles are effective because they divide us, and they make us distrust one another, and that to me is the scariest dog whistle that I see, because I see it resonating. I see it resonating in so many different communities, and I see it being accepted in too many different communities. In my civic engagement, in my organization, we focus on issues. We never support or oppose candidates or parties. That was a decision that was made by the founders of the organization early on, because we quickly discovered that the parties wanted our votes, but they did not want our voices. That is a lesson that I think we should be taking to heart, particularly in 2018, that if we focus on the issues, we're going to find that we have a lot more in common than we have the things that are dividing us. The dog whistles may not be as resonant as they are if we keep putting on our team jerseys and saying and keeping score as to which party is winning which elections. It's hard to do with the media watching the horse race. So one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that I am seeing a great deal more activism. At least in my community, activism has been present throughout my entire adult career. It's not just that. As a matter of fact, I see far more organization among ethnic minorities and racial minorities than I do even within the white community, which I think is a reason for great hope. There are so many organizations out there that are really trying to do the right thing. They're trying to register voters. They're trying to get people turned out to vote. They're trying to do this at the ground level, which is how we change things in this country. It's how we've always changed things in this country. So I've seen more activism. I've seen more organization, because it takes organization in order to get your people elected, get a more diverse electorate, to get a more diverse elected bodies. But probably the most important thing that gives me hope is the biggest difference in 2018 versus in the middle of the last century. The biggest difference is that everyone in this country, every citizen in this country, 18 years of age or older, has the right to vote. We have the tools at our disposal that women in the 19th century and the early 20th century did not have, that African Americans in the middle of the 20th century before that, but as the civil rights movement was gaining steam, did not have. We have the tools. And so as long as we can, as I said, take those team jerseys off, it does not matter whether Republicans win or Democrats win. It matters how we address the issues. We should be able to talk to any elected official, no matter what. Malou mentioned Newt Gingrich, and of course, I come from Georgia. I've been living with Newt Gingrich my entire adult career. And let me tell you something about Newt Gingrich. When he is not running for office, when he is not in office, he's actually quite a thoughtful and interesting analyst. He's a smart guy. As soon as he's running for office, all you're hearing from him is, we got to watch out for those felons, we got to watch out for those illegals, which are dog whistles of the first order. But beware of that sorting dog whistle. I've listened to a lot of the folks that we partner with, a lot of younger folks particularly in the African American community. They're not as troubled by that as I am. But I find that very, very, very disturbing, because as long as we're willing to sort ourselves into two separate parties and it becomes a competition between those parties, we're able to say that no, we are not gerrymandering based on race, we're gerrymandering based on party. We are not doing this stuff because we want to put racial minorities down. We're doing this because we're trying to do it for our parties. So I have a great deal of hope. Stay organized. Thanks. Stay organized, stay active, and keep voting. Thank you.
All right, do the panelists have comments on comments that other panelists have made?
Yeah, I'll just jump right in really quickly, because I know we have, I'm sure, a lot of questions. Elizabeth brought up a fantastic point about sort of the hypocrisy of the partisanship. It exists on the right, but I think what she pointed out too is on the left, where we immediately sort of sort out minorities on the left end of the spectrum and the whites on the right end of the spectrum. And I think it's definitely condescending, if anything, because it says that you should be basing your vote on these immutable characteristics of group identity, which is just incredibly patronizing and condescending. And I think it almost gets to the idea of what's the matter with Kansas idea. It's like, well, you don't know your own biases. You don't know your own interests. You don't know what policies you prefer or not. You should be voting X way. Well, certain people have a hierarchy of principles, and certain principles outweigh others, and we may disagree about that. Someone may put their evangelical principles above economic interests. That is their own doing. That is their own interest to do so. But claiming that you should put your group identity above all else, and that group identity means you should vote for X or Y, it is incredibly damaging. And it's also hypocritical, because it often comes from the very people who claim to promote diversity and acceptance.
So I want to offer a defense of identity politics. Mm-hmm. Let's take race out of identity politics for a sec. So imagine that it was in fact the case that people from Western states have much lower incomes than people from Eastern states, and that this was persistent. So if someone from Colorado moved to New York, they were likely to arrive they were likely to make a much lower income when they got there, they were likely to be segregated in a neighborhood with other people who came from Western states, that people from Western states who make $100,000 a year were likely to wind up in neighborhoods that matched what people who make $30,000 a year from Eastern states live in, that there was equivalent amounts of drug use amongst Western staters and Eastern staters, and yet Eastern state people who smoke a joint in college get to finish their college degree and have a career, and Western state people tend to get arrested. That the prison population was overrepresented by people from Western states. Now, I don't know how we would address that problem, but I don't think we would address it by saying all states matter. I don't think you could describe the problem. Like, set aside the question of what the solution is. I don't think you could describe what was going on without using the terms Western staters and Eastern staters and talking about how things are different for people from Western states. And I think it would be entirely appropriate for people from Western states to recognize that they have a common interest and to organize together because they have a common interest to solve, to solve a common problem. So obviously, I'm engaging in a very obvious metaphor here. I think that it is entirely appropriate in politics for people who have a common legitimate grievance to come together in order to organize and address their common legitimate grievance. I will note one thing, which, to your point about, like, I guess, partisan sorting, I think it is descriptively true. Regardless of whether you think that this is a good thing or a bad thing, it is descriptively true that people of color are overwhelmingly likely to vote for Democrats and that white people are much more likely to vote for Republicans. In some states, there's extraordinary polarization. In Alabama, for example, I think 96% of African Americans voted for Barack Obama, and well over 80% of white people voted for Mitt Romney. So setting aside, like, the virtues of that is true as a descriptive matter. I think part of the reason it is true as a descriptive matter is because part of organizing to find a common interest is it helps if you can join a coalition that is influential within a party. And racial minorities have succeeded in forming a coalition which is very influential within the Democratic Party. I think the downside of that kind of sorting is that it makes it very easy to engage in partisan shenanigans. So one consequence of having extreme racial and partisan polarization is it's very easy to identify who the Democrats are in a lot of states. And so if you want to draw a gerrymandered map, it's pretty easy to figure out which residents you have to pack into a few districts that they have minimal influence. It's very easy to figure out, like, oh, it is in fact the case that African American voters are less likely to have driver's licenses, and so if we pass a voter ID law, I, a Republican, know that I will be disenfranchising a group that is disproportionately Democratic, and that improves my likelihood of winning in the election. So I think there are unfortunate consequences to racial partisan sorting, but I also think it happens for a very good reason. And it happens for the reason that we have legitimate problems in this country that you can't even describe unless you acknowledge the racial element of them. And again, I think it's entirely appropriate, whatever your grievance is and whatever the group is, that if you have a legitimate grievance to band together and organize.
And to that point, because I agree with all of that, but as I said, living in at ground zero where this is actually happening, I just am going to tell you that yes, it would appear, empirically, it would appear that you should be able to, if you can band together and then influence the platform of a party, that is a good thing. However, at least what I'm seeing, just as a citizen from my point of view and from where I am, or from where I sit in an extremely diverse state, is that is not happening. Yes, you know, African Americans are voting largely for Democrats in Georgia as well. As a result, I would say, maybe not as a result, but right now that has produced the Democratic Party as the minority, as the extreme minority party in Georgia, with very little political influence. It is keeping Democrats in those highly packed districts elected, yes, but there are so few of them that there's very little influence that they have, for example, in the state legislature. And we can worry about Congress all we want to. Focus on those state legislatures. A lot more important things are happening there. At the local level, things are very different, but again, we sort ourselves in the places that we live as well. And so again, it's all extremely patchy, and you're not getting the bang for your buck that you ought to be getting for the organization that is going on. And what it is also producing among the groups that I am seeing on the ground that are working there, that are working, you know, tirelessly to turn out voters in underserved communities, is that it all gets focused on, are we going to be able to elect a candidate of the other party? Are we going to be able to get more Democrats in the state legislature? Are we going to be able to get more Democrats in Congress? Whether or not that's going to produce any results is for those particular groups is highly speculative. So all I'm saying is that I would be very careful of that, because the issues that the issues that we're all concerned about, and we see that all over the country, is that we really may have a lot more in common on those issues, but it's in the interest of the parties, it's in the interest of all incumbents to keep us divided so that folks can stay in office. This is all about the power and who has it and who would like to keep it.
Just really quickly before we get to questions, I'm going to blend both what Ian and Elizabeth have said. This gets to a very interesting question that's been, thank you. I'm going to blend both what Ian and what Elizabeth just said. And this, I don't have an answer for this, but this gets to an interesting question, especially within the DNC, about if you have minority voting blocks that are so reliably Democratic that they can oftentimes be ignored. This was something with the Black Lives Matter movement where they were protesting Bernie Sanders' rally. It's like, why would you protest a Bernie Sanders rally? Of course Bernie Sanders is on your side. But it's this notion that if minority groups are so reliably voting in one way that they can almost be ignored by that political party.
Much better said.
I mean, I guess I'll offer like a quick response to that, which is the other alternative is Donald Trump. I mean, like,
that's the tribalism.
Well, like the decision that, you know, most voters of color have made in this country to favor the Democratic Party is not an irrational decision.
No.
You know, it's a decision they've made because they're just as capable of engaging in an intelligent process and weighing their best interest as anyone else.
Right.
And so, like, when you have two parties, one of which picked Donald Trump, and the other one has been, you know, maybe not doing everything they could do to solve racial injustices, but is actually interested in, you know, solving racial injustices as an appropriate role for the United States government and for the state governments, like, you know, I would make the same decision. And so, like, you know, I guess I push back at this idea that, like, or at least the implication that either Democrats or voters of color are doing something wrong here. You know, if you're looking for fault, I would lay it with the people who have emphatically not heard the concerns of those voters.
I think my only concern is those who think that it's irrational for minority groups to protest the Democratic Party. I mean, as a voting bloc, they should make their voices heard.
Right.
What I don't like is the notion that, oh my God, they're irrational. Why are they protesting Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton?
Right.
It's because they need to make their voices heard,
Right.
Especially if they're a large constituency within that voting bloc. And this gets to the notion of, you know, are the Democrats exploiting DACA? Are they exploiting, you know, the immigration question? Are they exploiting the super predators? It's not so much exploitation, it's that these voting blocks need to be heard because that is the one voting block where the one party where they need to vote. I mean, because of the tribal nature of politics, they're not going to vote for someone like Trump or someone like Ryan. So they need to have their voices heard within the Democratic Party, at least for now.
And it also gets back to the point that, you know, democracy is not all just about voting. It's not all about just showing up on election day. It's about showing up on election day, but it's also about showing up afterwards. and staying organized afterwards and making sure that your elected representative is hearing from you. What we discovered in the 6th district, interestingly enough, is this reliably red district had an awful lot, there was an awful lot more interest in a Democratic candidate than anybody suspected that there was going to be. That to me is a reason for hope, especially since I live there. Is that, you know, in other words, we have sorted ourselves so completely, we are so able to elect someone that supposedly thinks like us in an election with very, very low turnout in a primary election, that all the rest of us that are living in the district don't matter either. This is so I guess my point is this is a really complicated dynamic that is being represented as it's just Democrats versus Republicans. It is a lot more complicated than that, and I think as citizens we've got some control over those complexities.
I want to turn to some questions. I'm going to do some compressing of questions. The first one is for Elizabeth and Baloo. Are women less racist than men? Put another way, more women are running for office these days, and would either of you expect that that would lead in some way to a lessening of racial tensions? Go for it, gals.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I haven't seen any data to support the notion that women are more or less racist. I've seen data to support that women tend to be more conscientious and men more industrious. I mean, that gets to a whole other discussion that's not, you know, within the parameters of this panel. But whether women are more racist, I don't know. I know that in terms of voting, women tend to become more conservative after they get married and have children. Mm-hmm. That's definitely indicated with the data. But I don't think that's correlated with necessarily racist beliefs.
Well, and I do think, again, I'm going to come back to it's all about the issues, baby. You know, you do see in states with, or in the legislature, no matter how conservative someone may be, I think there's probably more, women are able to find more commonality on some of the issues that matter to families, some of the issues that matter to education, and I think women are just generally more collaborative. There are fewer of us, so to a certain in elected bodies, so to a certain extent, I think you probably hang together because you've got some of those things in common. I too cannot comment on whether or not that transcends racial boundaries, but I will say that one of the things that does concern me as we move forward is that, of course, women are represented in every single ethnic and racial demographic in this country, and as we're advancing, you know, as you start working more and more across with other groups, particularly with immigrant rights groups or with groups that don't look like you, I do wonder whether or not, as we're seeing a greater focus on getting a more diverse elected bodies, what that does with traditional what we consider traditional women's issues, because there is not, for example, the consensus on choice among all of these groups that one might expect. And so I think it's, or on equality or other things. So I think it's just, again, it's complicated. And but the only thing I can say is that I know diversity in an elected body, in an electoral body, in an elected office is better than not diversity, and so we need to keep pushing it. I'm overjoyed to see the number of women that are running for office. I think it's absolutely wonderful. I'm thrilled to see the number of LGBTQ folks that are running for office. We're seeing a lot of that at the local level in Georgia, and that is, I think that's very encouraging. The more different points of view we have, and the more we focus on issues, I think the better results we're going to get.
Sort of following up on the comment that it's all about the issues, baby. Seems to me that a dog whistle is mostly used as in reference to comments made by people on the right. That's just an observation on my part. You may disagree with it. If so, say so. Do you think that Black Lives Matter is a dog whistle? And do you think that all lives matter is a dog whistle? This is taken from a comment that says, in South Dakota, citizens cannot understand Black Lives Matter. Signs in small businesses read, all lives matter. Comment.
Sure. I mean, I think that Black Lives Matter is the opposite of a dog's whistle. So, like, the idea behind a dog whistle is that you're saying something that's sort of coded, so that some people will realize you're saying stuff about race while other people won't. And my understanding is that the core demand of the movement for Black Lives was that we weren't talking about race enough, and that there are problems that are particular to the black community that have to be talked about in terms of race. And it was, if anything, a backlash against dog whistle style politics. The central claim was we have to address these racial injustices as racial injustices.
So I'll just add really quickly. I think that this is, my master's thesis advisor, he wrote this fantastic book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I'm more foreign policy, international security. And so for me, looking at this is like the tragedy of identity politics. It's so sad because I have no doubt that folks in South Dakota, they obviously, I'm sure, sympathize with folks who are targeted by the police. I have no doubt in my mind, if they're not operating from malicious intent, that they do care about lives. I think it's just a matter of the language that we're using. I think when they see Black Lives Matter, well, all lives matter. And it's almost like, okay, yeah, intuitively, yes, of course all lives matter. But the reason why they're saying Black Lives Matter is because Black lives aren't valued as much in society as white lives. And I think that language, we're almost just talking past each other. And I think part of the issue is that perhaps if the Black Lives Matter activists, instead of saying Black Lives Matter, maybe they just right out of the gate went with all lives matter. Maybe then people in South Dakota would say, okay, yeah, oh yeah, all lives matter. But I think when people in South Dakota or anywhere say, well, Black Lives Matter, well, what about all lives? Well, I think it's the fact that over time we've sort of, rather than stressing the unifying nature of communities, we've said that we're part of specific ethnic and minority groups, and these targeted appeals make sense because we want to be respected as minority groups. But I think because we've stressed less the unifying nature of communities and more of recognizing differences, we almost exaggerate differences, and it gets played out in the language that we use to unify people.
And I've got, I've got to say, as I said, I 20 years ago, I probably would have agreed with that. But, over a lifetime of change in a community, both professionally and everything else, I have to say the Black Lives Matters movement was just, it was life-changing. It was honestly life-changing for me in terms of point of view. Like I said, I prosecuted super predators. I've put people in prison on two strikes bills. I've prosecuted juveniles in adult court. I've done all of those things, and I'm not apologizing for any of that. But nevertheless, it was, when I worked with the police, and, I dismissed for a long time the idea that African Americans were more likely to get stopped by the police. I knew those police officers. Of course, that wasn't happening. And so when you start having somebody say it out loud and then bring you the facts, Black Lives Matters isn't just a slogan. There are facts, there are incidents, they're synthesizing a lot of experiences that were so diffuse and so disparate across the country, no one was paying attention. And when you bring all of that together, even for folks who have been living that, whose perspective has been very narrow and on the ground, it can honestly change the way you think about things and look at things, and that's what it's supposed to do. And if we're afraid of that, then we're not going to be moving forward. We've got to be able to state our beliefs. I think Black Lives Matters is a belief statement, and that we need to respect that and then look behind it and look at the evidence that supports it.
Okay, a student question. Malou, does identity politics vary in rural versus urban settings?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know if any of my co-panelists do.
That's
rural versus, the question was rural versus urban. Identity politics in terms of appeal.
The only thing that I can say is that at least from looking out at the landscape in my own state, it's a whole lot easier. It is a whole heap easier to organize in urban areas. And one of the struggles that we're having, because there is a huge drop off outside Metro Atlanta, is reaching out to folks. We know that there are folks that could use to be organized in rural areas. It's just hard to do.
Actually, no, I do have an idea about this. I don't know if it gets to the rest of the question, but it just popped in my head right now. And this is something I wanted to mention in my remarks when I wasn't able to get to it. The notion of like the welfare queen, or the focus on taxes. Right. It also it's belied by the fact that, like, if you look at non-defense discretionary spending, it's so minuscule compared to what we spend on, for instance, futile wars overseas. Right. And when you look at also like what are the appeals of identity politics, oftentimes what you find is that welfare and government dependency, whether through Medicare or Medicaid, is actually heavily tilted towards red states. So again, I don't know if that gets to the thrust of the question, but it certainly gets to the lie of the identity politics. It's like, well, we're appealing to certain groups, but I mean, who are the biggest benefactors of government largesse and welfare?
I'm not sure I understand what non-identity politics is. I mean, all politics is identity politics.
Yeah, in class politics.
I mean, if you're in a union, it's because the people in the union have a common identity as a worker. Right. I mean, abortion right. politics, you can't really separate away from people, who identify, who identify either as or with women. And that drives much of the pro-choice movement. I mean, most of our history of racial identity politics in this country is white identity politics. Right. I mean, what do you think the Ku Klux Klan is? Right. So I think that the way that everyone approaches politics is we are all a collection of multiple identities. Right. And in some elections, we think in terms of one identity more than we think in terms of other identities. But I don't think that racial identity politics are really different than, any other kind of politics, was it's just, people of like minds grouping together in order to achieve common goals.
I would just add one thing, not to disagree with my distinguished co-panelist. I think the one person who really did not appeal to identity politics or racial bias was Martin Luther King Jr. He stressed the idea of racial reconciliation. In fact, he stressed at civil rights rallies for blacks to protest with the American flag and saying, those people who say that you're not part of America, we are part of America. Right. He wanted to redefine what it meant to be an American. And I think that's sort of the stress of the unifying nature of communities, rather than sowing more division by saying we're blacks and we shouldn't be mattering. It's like, no, we're all Americans. We're all part of the racial fabric of this country.
I don't think that identity politics necessarily implies black nationalism. I mean, it's entirely consistent to say African Americans are Americans and, right. Are as much a part of the American fabric as anyone else. And also to say that there are, and I mean, this was especially true in Martin Luther King's era, that there are political grievances particular to the black community that must be addressed as the nation by the nation as a whole. You could have an identity as a person of African descent and an identity as a patriotic American, and these in no way need to be in tension with one another.
So, okay, definitions. We should have started this like a while back. So identity politics. My notion of identity politics, and maybe that differs from my co-panelists, is the idea of appealing to racial difference. That's why I think that MLK didn't necessarily do that. He appealed to the idea of racial reconciliation. I think when you look at someone like Trump or Lee Atwater or Obama or Hillary Clinton, they used the appeals both for benign and for malevolent purposes to appeal to a certain racial or ethnic or minority group, women, men, what have you. That, again, it's not necessarily malevolent, but there are different reasons why, and I think MLK is different from that history.
Well, and then, just from a non-academic, or from a citizen's point of view, because I get really tangled up in some of the language with identity politics, and it seems that what we're seeing is, because I agree with Ian and I agree with Malou, but the question about folks in South Dakota, implies that the only way that we can get around identity politics is to ignore the identities. All lives matters doesn't necessarily mean anything in the context of the actual issues that that minorities are confronting, or even rural white folks. It's appealing. It goes back to appealing to indirectly to that white identity. And so I'm with an organization that struggles with this all of the time, is can we actually say we're a women's organization and not be discriminating? Yeah, we can. But it's hard to figure out in this context when you're crossing the line between I'm an American, but I'm an African American, or I'm a woman and American, and I have a point of view on an issue based on my experience that is different, say, than Ian's point of view on that issue. When do we have that conversation rather than arguing with each other about whether am I coming to this as a white woman or a white man or a black man? I mean, when do we have that conversation? And that's really tough from a citizen's point of view.
Absolutely, yeah.
Here's a question from Robert George, who's a CWA speaker who's seated right there. And the question is, why doesn't Joe Biden get criticized by the mainstream media for doing dog whistles when he says that the GOP will put blacks back, quote, in chains, close quote?
I mean, as I recall, that wasn't the best news cycle for him when he said that.
He also said that Obama was an eloquent speaker. I think that also gets to the dog whistle, the assumption being that, certain minorities aren't eloquent. I think it's because he comes from the left, and the left doesn't want to demonize its own. But I mean, that's my cynical interpretation.
And I'm back to, if everything is going to be about, if you're this, you're a Democrat. If you're sorting ourselves by parties is not just necessarily the best thing on earth that we can be doing.
I guess I'd say pluralistic democracy is hard.
Yes.
I mean, there's not many countries, we haven't done a great job of it, and we've actually done a better job of it than any other nation.
Yeah.
And so, the notion that an older white man, even an older white man who served in politics most of his career and has a pretty decent record on race, would have a few backwards ideas on race, doesn't really surprise me. I mean, I've been a white dude all my life, and sometimes I discover that I believe really messed up things. It just happens because my experience is going to be different than other people's experience, and I think we have to. We all have an obligation to be open-minded and to try to be empathetic to people who have other experiences. But I think a consequence of living in a pluralistic society is even very sophisticated people like Joe Biden, who have played politics at a very high level, are going to not understand things, and that's just going to be an unavoidable reality.
And let's quote.
Sure.
Oh.
Yeah.
Not his best moment.
Articulate, bright, and clean, just because you don't have a microphone. Articulate, bright, and clean, not eloquent.
Yeah.
That's the words that Biden used to describe Obama.
That's what he said. Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So he's saying.
Basically,
Let the man speak
Robert,
for
why
himself.
don't? Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
I apologize. He was speaking to an audience 2 years ago. Joe Biden has been around a long, long time. He knew what his audience was, so I don't think it's right to say, well, he's an older white guy. He didn't quite know what he was saying. Joe Biden is smart. He knew exactly what he was saying, and that's the whole definition of what dog whistles are. You know what your audience is. You know what to say, how it's going to appeal to them to get political advantage.
Right, exactly. And I think that's sort of my cynical interpretation is that, and maybe we can coin this here right right now and change the political discourse and just call it reverse dog whistle politics. It's like the reverse racism. Because I mean, obviously, he was appealing to certain triggers within the liberal mindset that, oh yeah, the right, they want to put people back in chains. Oh yeah, they think that. Yeah, so I think that is that appeal on the other side of the political spectrum. And by the way, I know that this wasn't mentioned earlier. I know that, how many of you agree that race is a social construct? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it could be a social construct
Yeah.
and still be relevant.
It's relevant, but I just want to get this out there right now. Race is not reflected on the genetic level.
Right.
There are more things that connect all of us together than that divide us, and I just want to get that out of the way because there is no biological difference. Is not reflected on the genetic level. We should have actually started the discussion with that.
Right. Exactly.
I want to offer, like, I guess, a degree of defense of that particular mark by Joe Biden. Like, I would not have expressed that concept in the way that he expressed it, but it's in fact the case that the people that he was talking about went on to nominate Donald Trump. So I mean, again, I think that he said what he needed to say in a way that didn't convince a lot of people. But the notion that there is an increasing identity between the politics of white nationalism and the politics of conservatism in the United States, I don't really think that's a debatable proposition right now.
Hopefully policy doesn't get too carried away. I think our racialized society is very different than other societies, I think, because we racialized slavery, unlike many other countries. In fact, centuries ago, if you mentioned a slave, people would have thought of an Eastern European. Right. In fact, the word slave comes from Slav. Yeah. It's only in the United States where it became like these distinct racial groups of free whites and enslaved blacks, where we racialize the idea of slavery. It belies the notion that a slave is a slave is a slave. Well, no, like the notion of slavery has changed dramatically over the last several centuries. And I think, if you look at, again, there are very different demographic trends in other countries, but if you look at, say, Brazil, they have affirmative action policies, and I know this is sort of a little different than what we're getting to, but I want to make sure that we understand that, there are benign policies and there are like extreme benign policies that they're benign, they're almost evil in and of themselves. There is these special race tribunals in Brazil for all government positions, and it's an affirmative action in the most extreme case where they measure the width of someone's nose, the width of people's lips, hair texture. I'm not kidding. It's scary. So, I mean, the benign policies can go in a very evil direction, and it's for the idea of, well, we want to have more minorities in government. Well, where does that end in terms of, like, what are the evil policies we're putting in place to only look at people based on their immutable characteristics?
I think with that it's time to bring this to a close. Thank you for your attendance, and a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.
This was fun. Yeah, that's more fun than I thought. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Hey, we did it.
We did do it. We did do it.
Yeah.